Hi, I'm Leanne. I work at the Financial Times. If I was going to drink a coffee, it would be an oat milk flat white.
My man, Mihail. How you doing, dude?
I'm doing well. How are you, Demetrius?
I am great. I got a new shirt. It says Om Shanti. I am Om Shantian out of things right now.
Nice.
We might have to bleep that out because Leanne has been working so hard not to curse on this episode.
Bleep.
Ah, jeez. We cannot have one podcast without you mentioning them, and we're just gonna have to bleep that.
I was
Bleep.
just
It's gonna be.
I did it in the chat. Okay, I was being conscientious.
That's hilarious. Anyway, Leanne was awesome. I'm so some of the answers that she gave, I got goosebumps because she was nailing it so hard. Like the amount of value that she was bringing with these answers. What did you think though? And I just super biased what you're going to say right now, but I thought it was incredible. What about you?
I thought that her points were just so on the mark. I mean, around when she just basically started the entire conversation discussing structuring of a data science org in terms of maybe starting with limitations instead of aspirations, right? Constraints instead of like North Star goals. I thought that was such a realistic take on the state of, like, we spend a lot of time talking about data tooling, but we maybe spend not as much time talking about just like data organizations and efficiently running and organizing data teams. I thought that was such a realistic take on what the state of building data organizations looks like today, right? That while we being in the community, right, having these sessions, we're incredibly bullish on data and ML as a next big wave for the future. That for a lot of organizations globally, they still are trying to justify their investment in these ideas, in these tools, in these projects, and we're still at that nascent stage where getting that buy-in is something that's going to take time, right? That it's going to take having some of these wins that come in and trickle in, and these are the actual friction points the data teams deal with. And I think she just did a great job of codifying that struggle, right? At places that she's worked, just really good general pieces of wisdom for any data team.
Yeah, I loved the metaphors. There were so many good metaphors. And following up on that idea, she was talking about how it's like data is looked at as the little sibling in the organization, because one thing that hit home so hard to me was how Leanne said data teams aren't trusted with how they use their resources. Sometimes you can get like this, it just feels like they aren't being trusted with the resources that they're given or the tasks that they're given and how they go about meeting these goals. And that was brilliant. The other piece that I wrote down here was like, it's not clear how you articulate the value or why you need a data scientist instead of an ML engineer, or why you need a data engineer instead of a machine learning engineer, or now as they're called, MLOps engineers. And so whereas with like software engineers, it's very clear to the business what they do and how their value is articulated. But in the data spectrum, it's not as clear yet. And she boiled it down to, we're really new still, like you said, and it's just that maturity needs to happen, and we need to have this time where things settle into place. So that's it. Let's get into the actual conversation, and hopefully everyone out there will learn a new vocab word, waffling. Mihail learned it today. That was really, really good. And
you learn everything on this podcast. Everything. Dude, it's not just data. You learn vocabulary.
British slang.
British slang.
There you go. The other thing that I want to mention is that if you have any ideas on how we can make this show better and how we can bring more value to you, the listener, please just write us. Let us know. Reach out to us on Slack. What would you like to see us doing more of, less of, better? Do you want less of the the bullshitting around in the beginning of the episodes? Do you want more of it? I don't know. You tell us. We're doing this for you all, hopefully bringing you some value at the end of the day, or a good way to pass a little bit of your time while learning something. That's it. Let's jump into this episode with Leanne, and I hope you all enjoy.
We also prioritize any not any actual handwritten letters over written emails. Those are the ones. So anyone that goes to the trouble of writing us an actual piece of mail will get priority in terms of it.
We are definitely going to start doing whatever you suggest. And if it is
Literally.
if it's calligraphic by nature, just like you can
We're
probably
done,
come
we're
on
done.
and be the next co-host. Yeah.
You're
All right.
you're it.
There we go. Let's get into this actual conversation now. See y'all. If you want, we can start it off with either Seaweed or the guitars. So your choice.
So we can start with Seaweed because she's gone for for a bath because she had surgery 2 weeks ago. Not been able to
So who is
clean.
Seaweed? Tell us about what.
Yeah, that's a really weird way for me to kick off with Seaweed, right? Seaweed is my three-legged dog that I rescued, me and my husband rescued in Austin, Texas. She's a mutt dog, so she looks like a dingo, but she's technically a Texas healer crossed with an Australian stumpy cattle. So she is
wow.
sadly missing a leg, a womb, and a tail. So, you know, she's having a bit of a tough life, but gives a lot of love for that. So
She's a champ. And I heard she has flown more times in business class than I have because she flew from what was it? From the US to the UK in business class, if I get that right.
she did. Yeah, which so height of the pandemic, my husband unfortunately got stuck in the UK. We were both on visas working in the US. Well, this is a really long story now. I'm going to try and keep it short. I was stuck in the US in Austin, having a whale of a time by myself, by the way, and Seaweed. We were chilling out. Then so I was stuck with Seaweed over in Austin, but my husband was unfortunately stuck over here in the UK, midst of the pandemic. And we needed to fly back after 5 months by myself living in Austin. As a whale of a time I had, it was time to call it quits. And so we had to get back. Shipping a dog into the UK is a real difficulty. I'm not going to go into all the details here because I might have some people coming back on my back. But the long story short is that Seaweed got to fly in the business class cabin. It was my one luxury treat to myself, was that instead of flying economy was like $500 and business was $650 because of
nice.
because obviously flights were a complete disaster at that time between the UK and the US. And we bumped ourselves and we had a lovely time. I drank lots of champagne. Seaweed didn't, but she did sleep the whole way.
And she checked all the boxes, I imagine. You got all her papers in, and nobody's going to come asking you for any special papers.
Come to my house and be like, what's this dog? No, she's totally legally allowed here in the UK.
Yeah, I had heard about that because a friend of mine just moved to the UK like a few months before the pandemic, and he brought his 2 cats. And so he was like, ooh, it was a bit of a nightmare to get him over. So much so that he doesn't want to go back to the US just in case he ever has to go back and have to go through it again. So anyway, we're not here to talk about pets, as cute and lovable as they are. We've got a lot to jump into. I would love to start with this idea. I mean, there's so many places that we can go, but I think the most pressing on my mind is something that comes up time and time again, and I want to hear your wisdom on. How can we architect data teams? What are the structures that you have seen that have been winning formulas, and how does that look like?
That's a great question. I can shed some wisdom. Whether or not it's good wisdom is going to be a different question, but let's go for it. So I think it's such a difficult question because it starts with the fundamental fact that you've got to build for the business that's in front of you. That's the first issue, right? And, as much as we like in certain commercial focused areas, we can turn around and say, right, I now need to increase my headcount by 50. And, the whole business for a scale size there is maybe 1,000 people. 50 is a heck of a lot of new headcount for one department. And so you can have all these kind of architectures and these designs and these ideals that you want, but you're always going to be up against your commerciality, your resourcing, your OPEX from your headcount, or maybe if you're doing it through contractors, your CapEx budget. And so that's the first thing that you have to have in mind as a data leader that's thinking about, okay, where do I want to put my bets? Where am I going to hedge my bets when I architect my team? I rather would start with my constraints rather than my aspirations. And that sounds very sad, but I think it's because that's all, I'm more of a realist with a little bit of optimism thrown in. And if I know those constraints and those caveats, then I can start designing for the right team that I have. So, practical example, at the FT, we have 11 data scientists. We're roughly, Financial Times is roughly 2,000 people across. For those that don't read the Financial Times, we're a huge journalism media business. I'm not here to pitch the FT, by the way, I'm just giving some context. So, data science is a large part of what we do, but the purpose of data science was more to drive a lot in the beginning, a lot of our subscriptions and kind of our subscription strategy, and optimizing a lot of our decision making around B2C and B2B decision driving behaviors, right? So hence why the size of our team makes sense. So when I came in, I didn't really want to grow. That was just 11 data scientists. I didn't really want to grow my data science team. What I want to grow is my engineering resource that's actually going to make that happen, right? And so we've been doing a great job collaborating with our BI, business intelligence engineers, to be able to do a lot of batch modeling through our database layer in BigQuery. But where we will have massive issues in terms of our growth strategy is the fact that we can't do anything in real time. A lot of what we do is in batch. And we've done some stuff in kind of low latency, near real time deployments. And when I say real time, sorry, I mean near real time. So, for example, you land on our barrier page where it asks you to make a payment to start reading, and we can do some personalization there in low latency. That sort of stuff we're a million miles away. So I knew we needed to get some engineering resource. So the approach I took there was going to data platform, where we have a huge data engineering team, and we work really closely, but they're in different functions of the business. We've got underneath the CTO and underneath the chief analytics officer. Luckily, those two have our data platform team have always worked very closely with our analytics team. So it wasn't a stretch for me to ask for two new heads, essentially, or two new resource to then be embedded in data science as soon as I joined. And luckily, there was a good opportunity. We had lots of hiring and new headcount availability. So they were happy to put 2 new headcount towards that. So that's how I've done that here, right? I've only been at the FT for 12 months. Elsewhere, it's been a real pain. Again, I find that leading data science teams, the initial reaction for the data science from the outside of businesses, you just need data scientists. And it's like, well, there's that whole piece around, as we talk about all the time, the whole data acquisition, the whole data layer, and how you manage, maintain that, and the impacts of your architectural stack and your choices that will have on the data science team in the long run. So for a practical example, again at the FT, we've got a little bit of a Magpie architecture. We've got some stuff in AWS, some stuff in GCP. Again, comes when we get into kind of low latency deployment, I'm trying to wrap my head around the strategy around that to ease some of that friction. So if you've got your data engineering resource sat in a different bit, I'm waffling. I'm sorry. I'm gonna stop in a second. But if you've got your data engineering
keep
sat
going, please.
in a different technical, like an architectural decision place to your analytical and data science resource, you're gonna have these architectural playoffs that are really difficult. So that's another constraint thing, and then I'll talk a bit more in a second.
I don't think Mihail knows what waffling means. I don't think
is this a European thing?
Yeah, it means I'm just going on, and I'm just gibbering along, and I'm doing a monotone, and I'm really sorry. So I'm gonna try and tailor that back a little bit now.
Well, that's a really cool tidbit.
Yeah, I thought you might not know that one, because I learned that one fairly recently, and I thought it was amazing. I just always think about waffle machines whenever I hear someone say that, and
that was literally the thing that popped into my head. I was like, what? Waffling? Like, are you making something? Like, what is? Okay.
I'm just literally making a monotone at that point.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So there's something that you said that Leanne, that I thought was particularly interesting, which is this idea that, and maybe even a bit counterintuitive, this idea that instead of designing are thinking about teams, data science teams, in terms of aspirational goals, you think maybe you start with constraints, right? The things that are restricting you, maybe is another way to put it. And this is interesting to me because a lot of the times, one thing that we're seeing, right, a large explosion in recent years of like data tools and different companies and organizations trying to put out different tools that resolve, at least purportedly resolve, data problems for practitioners. But one issue that a lot of people claim is that there's just like organizational deficiencies, right? That actually the biggest problems aren't always that we're missing another tool to deploy to Kubernetes, but we're really missing is just we have these organizational friction points that make it difficult to get things done in data teams, right? And so when you mentioned that you kind of design with constraints, starting with constraints rather than like North Star vision goals, right? Like, hey, we're going to do the latest and greatest things in data science. Is that a function of some of these like organizational constraints? Or, because this is something that's I've also worked in engineering teams where we don't start with constraints. Like, we rarely think just purely in terms of constraints. I'm wondering how much of this is just like a function of being, a data organization, of being a data team that has to deal with this kind of stuff.
I think it's a really good point that you touched on, Mihail. Like, I hadn't thought of it that way before, that actually data's always kind of been the little brother or the little sister to the rest of technology, right? And actually, or maybe the middle brother or the middle sister. I'm an only child, so I'm just having to make some guesses here. But they always drew the short straw a little bit. And I think it definitely is that I think it's really easy to articulate in the business why you need an engineer or a product manager or a project manager. And it's still today is really difficult to explain why you need an ML engineer versus what we're seeing now, an MLOps engineer versus a data scientist versus a data translation layer, maybe with some like change management and delivery management within that, all with data expertise though. That is really still not very transparent for many businesses. And even with businesses that have, like the money supermarkets here in the UK, that have had really fantastic CDOs, chief data officers, alongside chief analytics officers, you still see there's those underneath the hood. I think there's still a lot of like friction pulling of like, what are these roles doing? But an engineer is still an engineer, but they're not, and you don't. And that's certainly what we see at the moment in my world is like, when we talk about, can we have some data engineering resource, it's not that data thought of layer, like, oh, we can't trust the data team though to determine what they need to do with that engineering resource. Technology need to determine that. And I think it's just a function of our nascence. Like, that is literally by definition where we are in our journey, is that we can talk all we want about how data science has been happening for 50 years, and actually it's just all statistics in disguise. But the reality is, in businesses, at most this thing has been happening for 10, and if you're lucky, maybe it's been happening in your organization for 5, and I would say that puts you quite mature if it has. So I think you're completely right. There is it's a maturity piece, coupled with a real lack at the board level of understanding of what it takes to be successful. And that in my experience, I found that the board or the key decision makers at that kind of C board or exec board level are willing to compromise on the data function more than they're willing to compromise on the technology function. And I mean that in no harm to any of those decision makers, but more it's just a reality of where we are as a field, and that we're a real growth part to your strategy, rather than a kind of a both keeping the lights on and keeping the business safe and growth. Data's still not seen in that way.
That was, I think, a really good way to articulate that. I mean, wow, there's so many follow-ups that I can think of to this. I mean, for starters, yeah, I agree with this, right? I mean, that there seems to be this tension here, that this conflict, and a lot of times data is a little bit on the fringes, at least maybe because of its nascence and the fact that it hasn't been around for too long. But we, as we're data practitioners, we're here on the MLOps community podcast. Like, we clearly believe this is like the future, right? That this has to be the way the world works. That we're not just this add-on that makes something a little bit better, that actually we will be the core of what makes future organizations modern and able to do things, right? So clearly we buy into this hypothesis that it's not just a little thing you add on as a bottom line on your, expenditures or whatever. We really believe that there's something fundamentally different about what makes data science and data scientists and ML really what it is. So how do we expedite this process? I mean, how do we get us to the point where people, these stakeholders, accept that this isn't something that you just, you do like a little trial project, and then if that goes well, great. Otherwise, cull, get rid of the data team, or like give less resources. How do we get to the point where there's more buy-in and we're able to move forward so that people they like trust us, you know what I mean? That this is what we're doing.
So for me, good question, and I don't think I have all the answers that are completely extensible, but for me, it comes down to two things on that specific question. The first is, like, you're either to me, in that context, how do you get that buy-in around data? You're either the type of organization where your ROI is data itself. By what I mean by that is you are either selling data as a product, or you are selling a capability that supports data people to do their job. So you are AWS SageMaker or Databricks, and so you're some kind of data platform service provider, or your ROI itself is like paid for essentially a version of data as a product, but paid for hits per machine learning model that's run, right? So that you're that type of organization where your ROI, your bread and butter, is the data services you offer. Or you're the other type of organization, which is that data is a part of your organization that combines with many other things to help your strategy. So in my situation, few organizations, I've worked for a credit bureau, I've been in telcos, and now I'm in journalism. That's our media. That's the kind of areas that I would say data is part of it. I've also built a startup that's been more on that data as a product side as well. I think when you're on that data as a product side, by very nature, if you suddenly no longer support your data capability, you can't keep your lights on, which goes back to that thing about like keeping the lights on, making sure your organization is safe and growing. So you can't physically do that unless you invest properly and you trust the person that you've put in charge of the data strategy, which is it's got to be so close to your CEO that they're hand in hand, because that's the whole nature of your business. I think in other organizations, now you've got a different focus, which is more around how do I operationalize the business change I want to see through the data services I'm enabling. So they're taking something simple like a churn or a propensity to churn model, for example, always a good one to rely on, right? But people still are like, oh, we can turn that thing off, because most of the times it might drive one or two key marketing campaigns, but it's not actually inherently changed the whole of the business, the way the business thinks about actually its whole commercial marketing strategy. And I think that's the next opportunity. That's where I'm very passionate about. It's all well and good putting a churn propensity model in production, but it's then about how am I not going to just get that to feed that 1 or 2 or 10 different marketing campaigns if that's what it needs to do, but how am I going to actually change my business behavior in those teams to rely more on the data services that I can enable them so that they're freed up to do things smarter, to help things. And it's all that typical data organization change that's really hard in the second type of business.
And do you feel like that a lot of misunderstanding comes from, let's say, the marketing, maybe it's the demand gen lead who doesn't understand how the machine learning can be leveraged to help them do their job?
And I don't think that's on them to necessarily understand that, right? I definitely think that's that in-between layer. So something we definitely got passionate about at the FT is we rolled out a whole data democratization program. And this is wider so data science sits within analytics at the Financial Times. And we have these different embedded folks who are there to essentially literally be embedded by the tool with the tooling and the technology. So our customer data platform, we have an individual who is there to be an expert in how that customer data platform works for the B2C marketing team, and then to be that point of contact and liaison between, say, data science and that commercial. And we hear this a
Wow.
lot, but the difference is that I think in this scenario that person is fully embedded into that kind of CRG and the toolkit at the same time, whilst also having been the physically like reporting line is in within the data and analytics world. So it's difficult. I think it's again about going for the business, but you do, I guess my answer to that is there's got to be something in between the team that's responsible for building and servicing the capabilities, the model, and the team that's actually consuming it. And oftentimes rely on the data side, the builder, and then also the servicer. But there's also a middle layer, which is like the embedded, this is how we're going to use and champion this capability.
What type of profile is that middle layer? What kind of person is that? Are they very technical? Are they very business? Do they have a lot of business acumen, I guess? What does that look like?
I
Because I
think they're the type
imagine
of
they
people.
have to, yeah, they have to understand the translation, which they probably have to be technical, but they also have to understand the business side. So it's like almost a unicorn in a way.
I was going to say, you're going to say that these are our new unicorns, so I've just created a new role. Um, I I don't think they are unicorns because I see enough of them, and I see enough of these people, like my, you know, different people I've either coached or mentored or even managed. Like I see so many of these people that come from not a data science background. That's why I say I coached or mentored them, because a lot of the people I've always managed have been data scientists, data engineers, and data infrastructure folks. And my passion is very much in ML and data science space, but more widely in the analytics community, you see these people who have come from like quite technical background, maybe did a lot of like data visualization, and have this gift to liaise with stakeholders. And I think a lot of data scientists can do that as well, but they have a natural storytelling ability, and they get to that point in their careers. I definitely feel like sometimes I've got to that point where I don't want to be that technically hands-on anymore. I want to do something else. I like working with people, and it's definitely that where you can play between that, like a really good product manager who's come from maybe an engineering discipline or a data discipline, who then has always had that gift to listen to user stories or to translate them into user stories, and then figure out that kind of mediation. That's the type of person. And I think again it comes back to the immaturity, I think, in our field, that we just haven't seen enough of those folks explode yet, because a lot of them don't see those career paths for them yet, and they're like their niche. You've got to kind of develop it yourself. It's not like I'm going to go out and advertise for a new, I don't know, like embedded consultation conduit between technical and commercial stuff, please. Maybe that's what we can call it.
That sounds like a really good description. I'm sure you get a lot of job applications with that one.
Really simple title, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
very sensible. Yeah. Was that the description or was that the title name? I don't know at this
I
point.
think it was a combo between them. It definitely wasn't the title name, but yeah, I'm not good at describing. Hence why MLOps never even came to me when I was like, there's finally a term for the stuff that we've been doing for the last 6 years.
Oh, classic.
One thing I'd love to maybe take a step back, and I'm fascinated because you lead data science at a publication, right? I mean, Financial Times is like a huge global publication. What does data science work look like on a day to day there, and what kind of problems do you guys deal with, and what are the main challenges that you guys face? What do you do actually?
Yeah, so our team was spun out more to support our product and tech capability. So what I mean by that is our digital first, I guess, strategy. So we're a very digital centered business. So whilst we still have the newspaper, which we call like the Pink, we also have a number of different, not just the app, the website itself, and our digital subscription model, but also a variety of other FT products under that. So we have events, FT Live, we have FT Specialists. So data science is there to support a whole realm of the group capabilities. What that means in principle is that we can be doing anything from doing a customer segmentation on our B2C user base in terms of how to actually upsell, cross-sell, whether or not we want to just kind of leave customers alone as well, right through to something like this quarter we're building an article vectorization or improving our article vectorization that then feeds into, I'm assuming that most people know what article vectorization would mean, but effectively deriving, okay, good, okay, I'm not going to go into the details then. So, and then that feeds into sort of our recommendation models that we derive, so right through from a B2B like topic recommendation model, so that might be an org level, or right through to say when somebody lands on our barrier page, being able to determine which article they see next, for example, right through to newsletters as well. So those are the types of things that kind of gives you a flavour. We're also responsible for a lot of like metric building here at the FT, which is a bit of a new flavour for me in terms of data science. So we're responsible for things like our engagement modelling, so how engaged are readers with us, as well as like lifetime value modelling. So we've got a very broad spectrum for quite what I would consider a very small team in that very broad spectrum.
So I'm wondering about the point that you made earlier when it came to real time and how you were talking about you're trying to get to real time. It is something, I mean, Mihail and I have talked about this various times on this very podcast about real time and the mystique that is around it, and how it seems like many companies want to get there, but whether or not it is useful or the reasons for getting there might sometimes not be so clear. Can you dive into why you feel like you need to get to real time and what that push is for?
Yeah, so I love this question because this is something I'm very passionate about, as again, building for the business you see in front of you. You know, don't, if you're in a heavily regulated field, don't feel like you have to push something out the door within 2 hours. You know, take the week or however long it takes to make sure that you've actually verified that model. So within that context, where we are at the moment is majority of our models are running batch. But the way that I go in a second. I'm not going to do another waffly monologue because I can go into some details about that in a second if you like, from a technical architecture point. But where we have derived things that need to run in low latency. So for example, if you as a user have signed up for a newsletter, we don't want to be sending you a newsletter you've already signed up for, right? So that's a simple filtering that we can do. But the architecture of doing that filtering is really complex in our current state of play. And what it means is that actually where those data assets sit is not transparent at all to the data scientists or the people curating and looking after the model. So like for me, if I was then told tomorrow, go and, you know, pull this repo down, do some fixes to this newsletter recommendation, there's a huge chunk of that model that's not exposed to me as a model builder, which is all this additional layer of filtering that's happening. That's a problem for us, and that's the bit that's happening. Is like there's two different things I want to talk about with near real time, right? There's filtering of data in near real time, and then there's actually running a model that needs to enact in low latency. So I'm just touching on the reasons behind the filtering for now. That's difficult for us to see. It's a little bit, and it's also a little bit, I mean this in the best way possible to my entire the FT team. We build brilliant things, don't get me wrong, but it's also a little bit Frankenstein monster, and I don't think anyone will kind of hate me for that, for saying that. So the push for when I talk about near real time is more to come up with a transparent architecture that it's simple for us to see, like have this generic type of way of deploying that we can see all of Frankenstein's monster within, like essentially within one wrapper, let's say. So we can actually see what's happening within the box. On the other side, where I talk about with low latency models, so one example is that last year we built a personalization model to enact on the barrier page. So when a user lands on our barrier page, we want to extract what data they've consented to for any personalization at that point, and then plug that into our as inputs to the model, and then derive the most appropriate barrier page for them to see almost instantaneously. that we physically can't do with our current architecture. So that's one practical example of what we want to do. I wouldn't say that like we're therefore gunning all, we're hedging all of our bets on making low latency happen, because that's just one example. But when you get into, say we ever wanted to do anything around, we have lots of third parties running things like our fraud detection. If we wanted to do things like that within data science, that's where we would need to up our ante, so to speak. So it's more to do with the nature of where data science has come from the FT to date, and what we've been delivering to the business, and kind of the next growth stage. We need to untap some capabilities, but also just for our own transparency, we need to untap some capability.
I've got a little side note or a bit of a tangent question, but as you mentioned, like there are third parties doing stuff with fraud. Do you feel like that's kind of the future of companies, like breaking up all of these little use cases and sending them out to third parties? Or do you feel like it's moving more towards, okay, now we've gotten from 0 to 1, we want to go from 1 to 10, we're going to bring that in-house, and it's going to be our thing that we're going to throw a bunch of data scientists and resources at?
I think it comes back to ROI, surely, right? Especially if you're working for a commercial business and not kind of an NGO or something like that. I think it comes back to, if you want to spin something up quickly and you have the resource in-house already to test that out, so like a quick fraud model, then do that. But obviously from a payments perspective, because we take payments for our digital subscriptions, we needed fraud straight away. Data science definitely wouldn't have existed at that point. So we went to a fraud vendor, took them, and now we're quite happy with their capabilities, plus they're specialists in that. Same with a lot of our NLP capabilities on our actual content. With those, a lot of that's driven by third party. And I honestly, I'm happy with that, because unless I wanted to suddenly spin up a team of 60 NLP engineers, I'm probably not going to be out their service. I'm not trying to champion, I'm not going to also say any names because then no one knows who, but I'm not trying to champion that way. But I think it's, again, organization in front of you. I think definitely if you're doing the data as a product capability, you want to be building it in-house, because what's your IP at that point? Yeah. If you're supporting a business to put information and content out there, or your my previous place of work, talk, you're providing internet service to people, your priority isn't to say, oh, but this is our secret sauce to make things happen. We're going to use the resource where we can to make the right decisions.
Yeah, so good. And I mean, I wonder, at some point, the thing that I think about is, do the data scientists or the data practitioners in the company, do they ever feel like, ooh, we're giving away too much, like they're going to automate me out of this? Or is there always something next that they can do, and you're just augmenting their abilities with these third-party tools?
It's definitely an augmentation, right? It's got to be an augmentation, because again, it goes back to that business understanding that if you're in that business, you have the domain knowledge to know how to stitch the things together. So again, if we go back to that fraud solution, right, that fraud solution is not going to necessarily know the ins and outs of exactly how you're doing your payments, exactly all the other constituent pieces of kind of, how your payment platform physically works end to end. It's just one part in a small niche, which is the job of that capability is to say, is this credit card a potential fraud or not? And you have the data and the capability to actually do that. If we wanted to do that, we'd have to go away and invest a lot in terms of accessing that type of data, etc. So it just, I think it's those things. It's again in this second type of business where you're not a data as a product type thing, where you're actually just building a business that's going to grow for some, whatever you're trying to achieve. I don't want to keep talking about the financial terms. It's all in my brain today. But whether or not you're a car manufacturer, for example, right? You're not going to be there thinking, okay, this has got to be my own USP about my special secret, maybe if you're Tesla, but my secret sauce about how I like architected the speedometer, and with all the like data capability, and that we've got an automatic speedometer that can shut off based on, you know, our underlying algorithm. I think you see a lot of car manufacturers actually advertising like that right now. Oh, golf clubs out AI driven flat face, and I'm like, what does that mean? But I don't think any of those golf club manufacturers are going to be like, but we had our own data scientists working on this. Probably have some data scientists who are using some kind of third party or
Yeah.
additional tool that's serving other golf club manufacturers. That's what I would think, but maybe not. And I think I'm probably doing a disservice, because my personal opinion should be every business should be building, you know, huge scalable data science capabilities and doing everything in house. But where's the value in that for you as an organization?
Yeah.
And there are situations where you're going to be better off with a third party whose purpose in life is to do that, in the same way that no one's going to build a Gmail for you to in your own business, right? Or you're not going to build
Completely.
Jira if that's how you want to do project management. There's certain things that you're just going to say, we're going to buy this thing in, you know, and there's certain things that you're going to say, okay. And I think we're just seeing that same contention in the data space.
I actually have 2 points on this, I think, because it raises some really interesting thoughts. One is this idea of you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel, basically. This is kind of, it's a common principle, actually, right? Back in the days, historical lesson thing, you know, when Netflix was getting started, they sort of had the option of, do we spin up our own cloud systems, our own, you know, data providers, or do we just piggyback off this new thing called AWS, right? And they very proactively made it this principle of what they called avoiding undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? Which is this idea that you shouldn't be spending any time building stuff that isn't really pushing forward your business, your core business, right? And so for them, having a bunch of Linux boxes in a data center somewhere at that point wasn't core to the business of trying to get people movies, right, and get people a good, efficient movie system that you could rent quickly and whatnot. So they opted against that, and that ended up being like a good strategic decision, which I think is exactly what you're getting at here. Is for a lot of data teams, if you can get away with it, and it's not part of your core business, then why should you? You know, even if we're engineers and we love architecting things and we love to have complete control over everything, you don't really have to do that if you can get away with it. And it probably isn't the best business decision, even if it'll make some of the engineers or the data scientists less happy, you know, because they don't have the full control. Which I think is one idea. And the second thing is, I think for a lot of vendors, they recognize their pitch shouldn't be about replacing. The pitch should always be about augmenting, right? You're fundamentally trying to sell to data scientists, or at least they'll be your first champions. So if you come in and you say, hey, we're going to get rid of you entirely, that's not going to make anyone happy. And it probably isn't even possible at this point, given the tech. But I think any business that knows what it's doing, their strategy will always be like, yeah, we're just going to make you better and faster what you're already doing, which you'll never lose people. You know, no one will ever complain for making their job easier.
It's really interesting you raise all this as well, because it's made me question my own mentality quite a lot. Because when it comes to actually like something I would call like a capability, i.e., when we said about that fraud, like that fraud detection piece that's just serving our payment and subscriptions team that does that, that's fine. But when I get vendors coming into me that are like, okay, so you're trying to solve this low latency in your end-to-end kind of machine learning flow, let's say, but not ML flow, but the whole end-to-end operational pipeline for both development through to deployment through to maintenance. I'm wanting to pick and choose how we do that in-house, because what I want to do, and I use this terrible analogy, but hopefully it will help some people see, my team are really set in a certain way of working that really works for them and it's really efficient. And a lot of these vendors that are out there right now mean that I'd have to take my team and they would have to have a massive step change in terms of using a new development environment, the new deployment pipelines, everything, and maybe also have to do a lot more hacking, like they might have to use some CLI interfaces and things that they're just like, oh, I've got a lot of like upskill, not just a migration but now an upskill time. That's a big cost sink for me on a small team. And so what I want to do is I want to say, right, we've probably got a bit of like a Ford Fiesta, that's a tech, but like, a Ford Fiesta, it gets me from A to B. It's really reliable and it's doing what we need it to do in the business. What I want to do under the hood is I want to put the Ferrari engine under there, right? And maybe I want to upgrade my wheels. I want to put some Michelin tires on them.
Yep.
And like that's what I want to do, but my team are still getting into the Ford Fiesta, but then like next time they put their foot on the accelerator, they're like, oh, like this is, it's just so much easier. So when it comes to vendors that are providing the actual development and deployment stack for specifically for data science, I actually feel differently, that I want to build that more in-house. I want to be more open source. I want to pick and choose because of where we are. And I think it's because of that scale. Again, it goes back to when was your need? It's because like that, that digital payments, we needed a fraud tool. Like we couldn't build something in-house at the time, so we just went to third party. What's happened in a lot of the data science and machine learning spaces, you've already got the team well established, and all of the tooling is only kind of starting to catch up to it in kind of in retrospect. And the tooling that we all needed 5 years ago, look at the ML observability space. We've all been shouting about, machine learning monitoring for Lord knows how long, excuse my language. And, we're still only kind of just getting there. And actually the best things on the market right now are actually in the open source, like Nanny ML, for example, right? And that, I think that's the weird thing, is that we've all got these teams, and now you've got all these vendors who are like, oh, you know what you're doing, just change back on it. If we were here for you 5 years ago, everything would have been great. But it's a really tough environment at the moment, whether you're a user or a provider, I think.
Huge points there. And I don't want to delay too much longer, because I really want to ask you the question about R in production. But if I can sum that up and try and distill what you're saying about your Ford Fiesta, which lovely cars, got it, especially the design. I can't help but smile when I think about the Ford Fiestas, and throw in the Ferrari engine in it. Would it not be also beneficial if you could just have a different abstraction layer that you bring the tools in on? And so the data scientists, nothing changes. They still get into their Ford Fiesta, but underneath the hood, you've souped it up.
Exactly. That's exactly my point. So from their perspective, they don't know from an infrastructure point that we're moving from a single node to Kubernetes multi-instances, and the scaling of that is all handled under the hood. They don't need to worry about that, because the way they deploy, still the way they see our deployment pipeline is exactly the same. They still push to GitHub, or they still push a commit to master, and that gets approved and merged, and then it's in. They don't need to know about that the CI and CD has all changed, that under the hood there's a slightly different service between serving and then hosting the model, and the capabilities that happen. That's where you need good engineering though, and you also really need data engineering and engineering who really understand this world and are willing to nudge the data science team, rather than say, I think we should use this capability. Yeah. I know there's been a lot about Kubeflow on this podcast lately, but somebody coming in and being like, we're now going to use Kubeflow and going to completely change your way of doing everything. If it isn't already, as you've talked about before, like a Kubernetes shop, for example, that's the practicality piece. So you're completely right. That's what I am really passionate about, is like, what does it look like today, and changing underneath the hood. And that's not, I don't think that's easy. And I don't think we've got it cracked yet.
Okay, so R in production. You are passionate about this. Can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah, so I started out my career in the terrible software programming language of SAS, which I don't even think we can call it a software programming language. I think it's just a SQL interface, right? But anyway, don't question me on that. Having before that done everything in C++, then moved to SAS. Weird trajectory. So when it came to going to a startup where everything we were doing in open source in 2014, I was like, oh, what do I learn to kind of to build regression models? That's what effectively I was doing in the original days. A lot of decision trees, a lot of regression models. Don't judge me. That was literally how this field was back then. And it seemed much more straightforward to go from SAS to R. And Python scikit-learn just wasn't there in terms of the support that it has, nowhere near the support it has today. But back in 2014, it still felt very shaky, whereas R had a huge community, had a great contribution and a really commitment to development, especially like Carrot package was really well maintained. So my journey with R has been that because we became a very R orientated team with quite a lot of Python actually thrown in around that. But development of models at the startup I was there for 6 years, was a lot in R, and then eventually in Python, because we had to do a lot of very low latency deployments. As I said, we were that data as a product capability. So deploying models to search on a user in real time with their consented data. So you had to pull all the data from a different API and compute the decisioning model, let's say, out in the same within a matter of milliseconds. That's when Python did come in to kind of multi-threading and helping with a lot of the multi-processing, parallel processing, sorry. You can edit that bit out. So multi-threading and parallel processing in Python. But prior to that point, we'd been building all of our models in R and had to just load balance them. I know I'm not going to say the word I was going to say there, but the load balance them a lot to handle that. So R in production, I've been putting R in production since 2014 and built lots of hacky ways before Rocker actually was properly supported through the Docker community, ways to kind of deploy R with a lot of very good engineering infrastructure resource behind it. Really disappointed that at the time, like in our startup, we just didn't have the capacity to properly contribute to the open source community for what we were doing. But I think, I was massively advocating for R in production here in Manchester in the UK at the time. And I've always had a little bit of a soft spot for R, even though now I've done various things in Python as well.
Well, I feel that the data science take on R is interesting, or like where R sits in the ecosystem is very interesting, because on the one hand, clearly Python has captured a lot of mind share in the last 5 years, and certainly all the big tech companies have pushed forward all of our tools, TensorFlow, PyTorch. I mean, all these things that the heavy hitters are, and the new tools are all usually the first language you support natively is Python. And yet, so it's like so a new person coming to the field will see this and just assume that that's the only way the data science is done. But if you spend any time talking to data scientists that are, got into it a little bit before 2020, let's say, R is actually still is used by a lot of data scientists, right? And a lot of data work is still done in R. And there's an interesting effect here. Because of that aspect, there is actually very extensive tooling and library support in the R language. I wonder, I mean, is this something where we expect that R to still carry and hold its own over the years to come, or will Python gradually just eat away at this, and eventually all the native R shops will just have to get with the times and switch over to Python?
I would be heartbroken if that happened. I really would be, just because the grammar of graphics in R is so beautiful. I just feel like, as well, for people, when we talk about scaling data science, I think R is one of those languages that, from a statistical sense, is so easy to get to grips with very quickly. It's purpose built. So that's, without going into R versus Python debate, I think specifically on your question, the R Studio themselves has invested a lot to bring all the tooling and capability to the forefront, and we're really seeing the dividends pay for that now. So the whole tidy models universe does a lot of what ML flow says on the hood, for example, but for R. I think where R's having a hard time is specifically like a lot of the open source tooling hasn't really accommodated for R upfront, for example, and it's kind of like an afterthought, or it's like, oh, R isn't on our roadmap. And I think that's where it's going to suffer, is that our studio can do so much and they've invested heavily, but they've also had to go code agnostic, right? Our studio are now supporting everything that they build that's more of an enterprise scale or paid for license, is supporting both Python and R, because I think they're realistic about that. I think it depends what happens at the universities. I think that would be a teller for that, because that was the whole thing with SAS, is that a lot of people, SAS really got into the university institutions, and a lot of people learned SAS. I think it's where universities decide to hedge their bets in terms of Python or R from an open source perspective, or in fact potentially Julia, and what training comes out of that. I've always been one to say you should, as a good data scientist, specifically data scientist, you should be able to work fairly code agnostic, right? The concept should stay, especially with the way that the packages and libraries are today. You don't have to be building a logistic regression from scratch anymore, where you understand the weights of evidence equation and log odds. It's literally all out of the box for you, so you should be able to switch around your coding, the language you're writing in. I don't want to see R eaten by Python, and I think it will always have a fairly good stead, but I think the university and the education system will have a lot to say for that.
I think you're right. Julia is up and coming. That's another dark horse to keep your eye out for. And seeing that even at the university level, computational programs, mathematics programs that are maybe even starting with Julia before Python. And then Python ends up being this kind of weird player in the whole space, where you can do a lot of stuff like ML and data science, but you can also like write servers in Python, right? Like Django in the old days, but now even more recent tools like Fast API. So it kind of does a lot of things, but I don't know. I don't know that I'm super optimistic, to be perfectly honest, about R in the future. Don't make that a hot take. This is
No.
something you should tweet.
I was just gonna do that.
I think you might be right, though, unfortunately, just because Python is so generalist.
Yeah.
But coupled with the fact that you have extremely well-versed and well-knowledge maintainers in the specific libraries like Spacey and obviously everything with Hugging Face is all built in Python. So there's so that you've got a great, like, you've got the T shape, right, down. So not down to the T. Oh gosh, the T shape down to the T in the Python language, and it does make me sad, because we're at the Financial Times. Our data science team is in our shop at the moment. We will go towards more code agnostic, with different things, as I said, about our maturity curve, but that's not in any time soon, because we don't need to, right? So it's about what capabilities can we build with R, and that's where I've found, there's so much on the market now, but it's all for Python.
Yeah, totally. So, all right, want to wrap up with a few last questions for you, maybe a little rapid fire. First one is, what was the last book you read?
Children of Time, Adrian Tchaikovsky.
Oh, nice. And what was the last bug you smashed?
Oh, I don't think I smashed. I saved a beetle from my bathroom and I put it in the garden the other day. That's was that like a physical bug or like a compute bug?
Software bug, but it's fine. You can do a physical one. That's totally okay.
You meant a physical one.
You were like actually one of the first people that has interpreted it that way. And whenever Demetrius asked that question, in my head I'm thinking like, people must know that this can go both ways. And then everyone knows I was like, no, the software bug. But you actually interpreted it literally, which, thank you for someone who's sensible about the question.
Okay, I'm just not gonna. I'm gonna let this one slide.
Yeah, go with that. That was the good answer. No, it's funny because I don't know if we have time for this long story, so I'm just gonna leave it right there. Great answer. Last time that you saw some machine learning advertisement or marketing that made you laugh because of how corny it was, or it was just well done. Either or.
That's a really tough question.
Because there's it's
I
just
don't
not
think we're
that
very
good. The marketing
Yeah, I
teams
don't
aren't
think
that
we're
good.
very good at marketing, are we?
Well, that's it, yeah. But that should
that's
also
the answer.
mean, yeah. There we go.
There is none. There is none. It was a trick question.
Yeah.
Oh no.
So we're gonna keep going because that was a perfect answer to sum up the state that we are in. What is a piece of technology that you are bullish on that might surprise people? So you can't say R. We already know your love for R. What is another one? And it can be, I feel like I gotta preface all these questions now because I don't know where you're gonna take them. But it could be even like home automation or something. It doesn't have to be like software. I don't want to bias you with like, oh, Kubernetes.
Oh,
Or,
okay. I don't know. That's a really hard question. Wow. I know.
There we go.
The like plant watering garden automation space.
Oh.
Like automating doing things in the garden, because that's really hard, but it's also really time consuming. That's where I'm gonna go.
Brilliant. I love it. It was worth the wait.
That was
Last one that you're really going to love if you've been loving all these last questions. It is, how do you want to be remembered?
that I waffled. No, like on my tombstone is this question, or is it just from this podcast?
No, yeah, more like when you leave the planet.
When I leave the planet, that I finished loads of different hobbies. That's how I want to be remembered. She always finished loads of different interests. She did a lot of different things, did Leanne?